A good net of Shabbos. We are learning Pirkei Avot, and a couple of weeks ago we learned the third chapter of Pirkei Avos. Akavya ben Mahalalel says, if you look at three things, you won't come to even wanting the possibility to do a sin. Know where you come from, where you're going, and in front of whom you're going to have to pass judgment in front of. Where did you come from? You came from a smelly drop. Where are you going? To a place of dust and maggots and lice. And who are you going to be facing? You're going to be facing King of all kings. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Melech Malchei Blochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the King of all kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. And if you think about this, you'll never come to sin. You never even want to sin. Now these words, Histakel b'shloisha dvarim, look at three things and you will never come to a sin, was stated earlier in Pirkei Avot by Rebbi. Rebbi says, if you look at three things, you won't come to the Aveda. The same words. Know what is above you. There's an ayin roya, v'oizen shamas, v'chol masecha b'sefer nichtovim. There's an eye that sees, there's an ear that hears, and everything you do are written down in the book. Now, it's the same purpose. It serves the same purpose. You won't come to sin. But it's an altogether different message. Know that there's somebody watching you. God is seeing you. God hears what you're saying and understands your motives. And all of your deeds are written down. They're permanent. You can't get rid of them. You can't forget about them. The question is, the author of this Mishnah is Rabbeinu HaKodesh, who lived about the year 200. The Mishnah of Akavya ben Mahalalel, on the other hand, he was alive during the temple, about 140, 130 years before Rabbeinu HaKodesh. So he was approximately 100 to 130 years older than Rabbeinu HaKodesh, about 6 generations before, and maybe up to 8 generations before, because he criticized Akavya and Shmai and Naftalion. So the question is, someone who preceded Rebbi by over 100 years said the same thing or the same idea 100 years before Rebbi, and the ideas are still relevant because they're recorded in the Pirkei Avot. Why are they relegated to a later chapter? Now, there are explanations why that I give in my book, or I've given on these videos, why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a student of Hillel and Shammai, why he is relegated to after Rabbeinu HaKodesh. And it has to do with the yichus of the Nesius, of the preceded of Israel, that the head of the Sanhedrin wasn't always a descendant of King David. The head of the Sanhedrin was the greatest scholar of the day, or the greatest 2 scholars of the day. We find that Shimon HaTzadik, who was a Kohen, inherited the position of Ezra, who was also a Kohen. And they were the spiritual leaders of the day. They had the temporal leadership. They were given the charge by the king of Persia. They also were the Kohanim Gadol, they were Kohen Gadol, and they also were the head of the Sanhedrin. After Shimon HaTzadik, there was Antigonus. He wasn't a Kohen. And after him were Yosi ben Yoezer and Yosi ben Yechanan. and they also were not a Kohen, and they were not Leviim. In fact, when you go down the list, they were great men, but their yichus is not mentioned at all. Even though Hillel and Shammah, Hillel is mentioned, Hillel's yichus going back to the household of King David, although some claim it goes through a daughter, and he was really from the tribe of Benjamin. But Hillel was the leader of the Sanhedrin, and after Hillel died, the rabbis decided that his descendants, if they were worthy, were going to be the heads of the academy. And so, after Hillel dies, first there's Shimon, the son of Hillel, then there's Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Shimon, and then there's the first Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was supposedly among those who were murdered, the Asor Harugi Machas, the 10 martyrs. I wish to tell you, though, however, that this is a very, very difficult thing to discuss because it's so prevalent. The story of the 10 martyrs requires another video by itself. But Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who was murdered at the time of the destruction of the temple together with Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, could not have been part of the 10 martyrs. The 10 martyrs came after the Bar Kokhba revolution, which is in the year 132 to 136, 135, and the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was murdered after the destruction of the temple, which is 68. It was about 64 to 66 years prior to 67 years before the death of the Asar Harugi Malchus. So they could not have been part of that group, and either the poet who put it together used poetic license to include them, or else there are two other rabbis whose names were similar and were misunderstood by later generations to be Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yishmael ben Gadol. At any rate, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Gamliel I, was murdered, and his son, Rabbi Gamliel, later takes over the Nesias. But in between Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Gamliel was a period of time when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was installed as the head. And for that reason, Rabbeinu HaKodesh removed him from the Nesias, removed him from the list of Nesiim, so that people should not make the mistake that he was really considered a Nasi. It was just that he was in charge of the Sanhedrin for various reasons, or it was too dangerous for Rabbi Gamliel to surface and take over the Sanhedrin, because the Romans who murdered Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would have murdered his family, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's family. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai assured them that they would not be taking a position of leadership, and therefore could remain as figureheads, but they had no power. Had they gone into the Nesias right away, this would have been very, very bad for Rabbi Gamliel and his family. So, because the Romans would kill out those who led the rebellion against them, and they would kill out not just them, but their descendants. And so they were ready to kill out Rabbi Gamliel's descendants, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and his descendants. So the descendants of Rabbi Gamliel and his descendants, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, ultimately Rebbi, would have been killed had it not been for the intervention of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he intervened on their behalf and made sure that they would have no suspicion of running another rebellion by not having any power. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the official head of the Sanhedrin, but not really as a Nasi. Well, that's the reason why he's placed afterwards, because Rabbeinu HaKodesh wanted to establish that after the death of Hillel, the family were given the title of Nasi and the head of the Sanhedrin. In fact, the Rambam in his in his introduction, does mention that at the same time that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was around, Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi, and therefore the Nasius, or the chain, goes from Rabbi Gamliel rather than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but this statement of Rebbi, look at three things and you will not come lidei aveda. This is a teaching. And this teaching is the same as Akavya ben Mahalol's teaching, except it has a different explanation how you avoid sin. Why would you quote this 100 to 140 years when afterwards? Rabbeinu HaKodesh lived 100 to 140 years after Akavya, and this idea, how to avoid sin, was already established by Akavya's words. How do you take the later idea and place it before Akavya's words? And the answer that I came up with is as follows. Akavya's words are very graphic. You come from a disgustingly smelly drop, and you're going to a disgusting place with your fat and your bones and your flesh. It's going to rot inside the grave. And after all of that stinky, rotting decomposition, your soul is still going to have to face God. Amen. That is something that's a turnoff for most people. Most people, when they think about disgusting things, turns their stomach and they don't want to think about it. Rabbeinu HaKodesh's advice is easier to follow. Realize that there is a camera watching you, and there's a recording machine listening to you, and that there is a typewriter, a computer, that's writing down everything that you're doing, recording everything you're doing, everything that you're thinking, everything that you're saying. All of this is recorded. Where is it recorded? It's recorded in your body. Your body is the repository of all your thoughts and actions and words. And God just has to read the report from your face, from your limbs, and so on. This is something that is easily thought about and doesn't disgust the person. And it can motivate the person, realizing that he's going to have to face the music afterwards. Because they say, for example, that Reuven tried to save Joseph. And he put his life out on the line to save Joseph. But the rabbis tell us if Reuven had known that his actions were going to be recorded in the Torah for all times to see, Reuven would have himself tore him out and jumped into the pit and taken him out. But he didn't realize that. He didn't realize that his actions would be recorded in the Torah. Had he known this, he would have behaved differently. So when a person realizes that his actions are recorded eternally, this has an effect on the person, not to go ahead and give himself a permanent black eye in front of God. But the person still is enticed by sin. And sometimes the enticement can overpower what you realize will be happening to you. Comes Akavya ben Mahalolel, and when a person really thinks deeply into Akavya ben Mahalolel's teaching, you don't want to sin. You're going to decompose and stink. You're stinking primarily because of your sins. A person who doesn't sin, his body remains whole, does not decompose. We just had a case a year ago. Shlomo Edelman, a Lubavitcher Chassid, a religious, holy Lubavitcher Chassid, I might add, shlich of the Rebbe in Morocco. A year after he was buried, was reburied in Israel, and his body was whole. It didn't stink, it didn't decompose. A holy person does not decompose. Why would you want to cause yourself to decompose and stink and rot? So when a person thinks about this and realizes, where do I come from? Why am I such a person who gives in to their desires when all it's going to do is causing me to rot and to stink? When a person thinks about that, you really don't want to sin. You'll never even be tempted to sin. And so the reason why Akavya's words are later is because this is the second stage. First, you have to try to deter the person from sinning. And then you come to an even higher level. You won't even want to sin. And you can't reach the higher level right away because most people don't want to think about these things. Most people don't want to think how disgusting it is in the grave. We decompose and we stink and we rot. And most people don't want to think about their sources of a smelly drop because you don't like to think of themselves as something disgusting. But if you have come first to realize that everything is accorded by God, but still you're tempted, when you think about Akavya's teaching, you won't even be tempted. The initial service to God comes from thinking about that everything's recorded. But the person has to come to a higher level where he won't even want to be tempted to sin. And that's why Akavya's teaching is later.